A woman drove 400 miles to see David Gilmour perform. She left after 3 songs, and in the 30 years since that evening, she has never once explained why. Her name was Margaret Ellison, and in September 1994, she was 41 years old and living quietly in Edinburgh, Scotland, in the kind of life that looks unremarkable from the outside and is held together from the inside by a small number of things that matter disproportionately. She worked as a secondary school librarian. She had been divorced for 4 years. She had one adult son who lived in Glasgow and who she saw on alternate weekends. She had 3 close friends and no particularly significant hobbies, with one exception. The exception was David Gilmour. This requires a brief explanation because the word fan, which is the obvious word, doesn't quite capture what Margaret Ellison's relationship to his music had been for the previous 20 years. She had heard The Dark Side of the Moon for the first time at 21 at a friend's flat in Edinburgh, and the experience had been of the kind that certain music produces when it arrives at exactly the right moment in a person's life, not merely pleasurable, not merely impressive, but genuinely clarifying, as though something she had not known she was confused about had been made suddenly, unexpectedly plain. She had bought the album the following day. She had bought everything that preceded and followed it. She had attended Pink Floyd concerts in 1977 and again in 1987, traveling from Edinburgh to London on both occasions, and had described the experiences to her friends in terms that her friends understood as enthusiasm, while recognizing that what she was describing was something more specific and more private than what the word enthusiasm usually covers. She was not, in any other area of her life, a person who traveled for things. She did not go to the theater in London, or concerts by other musicians, or sporting events in other cities. The specific gravity of this music was different from anything else in her life, and she had never felt the need to examine why. It simply was what it was. When the tour was announced, David Gilmour's solo shows in the autumn of 1994, following the release of The Division Bell and the Pink Floyd tour that had preceded it, Margaret bought a ticket to the Royal Albert Hall show in London for the evening of September 28th. The distance from Edinburgh to London is approximately 400 miles, depending on the route. She had driven it twice before for concerts and had traveled it other ways as well. She booked a hotel for one night, took a day of holiday from work, and began the drive south on the morning of the concert. She arrived in London in the early afternoon. She checked into the hotel in Kensington, a modest, functional place that had the specific quality of hotels chosen for proximity and price rather than experience. She walked in Hyde Park for an hour. She ate dinner alone at a restaurant near the Albert Hall at 6:30, a set menu that she later described to no one in particular as perfectly adequate. She arrived at the Albert Hall at 8 o'clock, took her seat, and waited. The venue was as it always was, that specific curved interior, the warmth of the lighting against the ornate plasterwork, the particular quality of acoustic expectation that a room built for music creates in the people sitting inside it. Margaret had been inside the Royal Albert Hall twice before, both times for different events, and she understood it as a space that imposed a certain quality of attention simply by existing. The Albert Hall is not a neutral room. It has a weight to it, the accumulated weight of the music that has been performed there across a century and a half, the sense that the building has been listening for so long that it has developed its own specific quality of silence, different from the silence of ordinary rooms. You sat differently in the Albert Hall. You listened differently. Margaret's seat was in the stalls, left of center, 8 rows from the front. She had bought it several months earlier and had checked the sightlines several times on the venue's seating plan. It was a good seat. She had spent what felt like an excessive amount of money on it, which she had not minded, because this was not an area of her life where she had ever minded spending money. The categories of necessary and unnecessary worked differently when it came to this. The audience around her was the kind of audience that David Gilmour concerts attracted in the mid-1990s, predominantly in their 30s and 40s, overwhelmingly attentive, with the specific characteristic of people who had been waiting a long time for something and had arrived in a state of preparation for it. Not excitement exactly. Something more settled than excitement. More like readiness. The hum of conversation in the hall before the show began had the quality of people who were already, mentally, somewhere close to where the music was going to take them. The show began at 8:30. What happened next is something that Margaret has recounted on 2 separate occasions to 2 different people. Her friend Carol Whitfield, who lives in Musselburgh and has known Margaret since they were both 23 years old, and to her son Douglas, in a conversation that occurred approximately 2 years after the night itself. The accounts are not identical in their detail, but they are consistent in what they report. That for the first 2 songs of the evening, Margaret sat in her seat and experienced something that she recognized in real time as significantly different from what she had expected and had experienced before at concerts of this kind. She described it to Carol as feeling like the wrong frequency, a phrase she used and then qualified and then retreated from, and then came back to, unable to find anything more accurate. Not that the music was wrong, she was careful to make this distinction, but that something about her reception of it was wrong, as though the channel through which this music had always reached her had shifted or was temporarily unavailable. She could hear what was being played. She could recognize it. The hall was full of people who were clearly having the experience she had expected to have. She was not having it. After the 3rd song, which was Wish You Were Here, played in a version that most of the people present would later describe as one of the most moving performances they had ever witnessed. The applause running to several minutes, and some people in the stalls openly in tears. Margaret Ellison stood up, excused herself past the people in her row with the quiet efficiency of someone who does not want to draw attention to what they are doing, walked up the aisle to the back of the hall, through the lobby and out of the Royal Albert Hall onto the street. She walked back to the hotel. It took approximately 15 minutes. The evening was cool, and the streets near the Albert Hall on a Wednesday in September were not busy, and she walked without stopping and without looking in any particular direction. At the hotel, she went to her room, sat in the chair near the window, and stayed there for a substantial period. She could not afterwards say exactly how long, without reading or watching television or doing anything except sitting in the chair looking at the window. The window faced another building. There was nothing particular to see. She was not trying to see anything. She was simply sitting with what had happened, or with what had not happened, which was in some way the same thing. She ordered tea from room service at some point during the evening. She did not finish it. She went to sleep eventually, and slept without difficulty, which surprised her slightly when she thought about it afterward. She drove back to Edinburgh the following morning without stopping. She returned to work the day after that. She said nothing to anyone about the concert for several weeks, and when Carol eventually asked her about it, Margaret said that the concert had been fine and moved the conversation to something else. Carol, who had known Margaret for nearly 20 years, understood from this response that the concert had not been fine, but also that this was not the kind of thing Margaret wanted to discuss, and she did not press. The fuller account, the one involving the wrong frequency and the sitting in the chair, came some months later, in circumstances that Carol has described as a conversation that began as something else and arrived at the concert without being directed toward it. Even then, Margaret did not offer an explanation. She described what had happened in the chronological sequence: the drive, the hotel, the dinner, the Albert Hall, the 3 psalms, the walking out, the chair, the drive home. But when Carol asked why, what she meant by the wrong frequency, what had been wrong, what had caused her to leave, Margaret said she didn't know. She said this with the specific quality of someone saying something that is exactly true, not as a way of ending the conversation, but as a genuine statement of the situation. She had sat in a chair in a hotel room in Kensington for what might have been an hour or 2 hours, and she still didn't know. and she had driven 400 miles home, and she still didn't know. And several months had passed, and she still didn't know. Carol asked her whether she regretted going. Margaret thought about this for a moment and said that she didn't think so. She said she thought regret would require understanding what had happened, and she didn't understand it. She said she thought something had happened that she didn't have the equipment to understand, and that she had come to accept this as the accurate description of the situation. The conversation with Douglas, 2 years after the concert, was briefer and more oblique. Douglas had heard the outline of the story from something Margaret mentioned in passing, and he asked about it with the specific quality of concern that adult children sometimes direct at parents. The concern that is partly about the event being described and partly about what it might indicate. Margaret told him, again, the chronological sequence. Douglas asked if she was all right. She said she was entirely all right. He asked what she thought had happened. She said she thought something in her had shifted in some way she didn't understand, and that the concert had been where she discovered this, rather than where it had happened. She said this very precisely, making the distinction carefully, because the distinction mattered to her. David Gilmour's 1994 tour of the United Kingdom was reviewed extensively. The Royal Albert Hall shows were described in multiple publications as some of the finest live performances of his career. His playing that autumn was characterized by music critics as having a quality of emotional directness that exceeded even his previous work, a quality that several reviewers struggled to put into words, and instead illustrated with references to specific songs and specific moments in the performances they had attended. Hundreds of people who were at the concert Margaret left attended the same show, and most of them left with accounts of an exceptional evening, with memories of specific moments, specific songs, specific instance when the music did what music at its best sometimes does. They left describing an experience that Margaret Ellison had bought a ticket for and driven 400 miles to have, and had, for reasons that have never been explained to her or by her, not been able to reach. There is a particular kind of question that some experiences produce, not questions about what happened or even why it happened, but questions about what the gap between expectation and experience signifies, what it says about the relationship between a person and the thing they'd have loved, and whether a love that is held for 20 years can contain within it a night when the channel goes quiet and the signal doesn't arrive. These are not questions with answers. They are questions that sit with you. Margaret Ellison still lives in Edinburgh. She is in her 70s now. She still owns every record David Gilmour has made, including the ones that have been released in the years since September 1994. She listens to them. She has not stopped listening to them. The music still does what it has always done. She has said this to Carol on the occasions when Carol has asked. The channel, in the context of records at home on an ordinary evening, still works. What happened at the Royal Albert Hall on the 28th of September 1994 was something specific to that place and that night, and the particular state she was in when she arrived there. And she has no theory about what that state was. She has not attended another concert since the Royal Albert Hall, not because she decided not to. She has simply not gone. There is no stated decision about this, no moment at which she resolved to stop attending live music. She has simply not gone, in the same way that people sometimes stop doing things they once did without making a decision to stop. The way a habit ends not with a conclusion, but with an absence that gradually becomes its own kind of answer. When Carol asks her occasionally whether she might go to something, she says perhaps, with the specific quality of someone who means it and also cannot quite imagine it. She does not say this with sadness. She says it with something closer to equanimity, the specific equanimity of someone who has accepted that some things remain unresolved and has found that accepting this is not the same as losing something. She has never explained why she left after 3 songs. Nobody who knows her expects her to now. The explanation, if there is one, appears to belong entirely to the same category as the experience itself, the category of things that have no adequate language, that resist articulation not because they are hidden, but because they are genuinely beyond the reach of the words available. If this story of Margaret Ellison, a 400-mile drive, and 3 songs in the Royal Albert Hall moved you, if it made you think about the concerts you've attended and the ones that reached you, and the ones that didn't, and the question of what the difference was, subscribe and hit that thumbs up button. Share this with anyone who has ever been somewhere they expected to feel something and found without explanation that the frequency was wrong. Have you ever had a moment when music you loved didn't reach you and you've carried that without knowing why? Let us know in the comments and ring the notification bell for more stories about music and the ways it fails and finds us.